You're listening to Soundrise Podcast, a show hosted by Alex in Serbia and Vlada in Poland.
Each week we cover a different artist or band and engage in an open and spontaneous debate and discussion about specific parts of their discographies. Our goal is to expand our musical horizons and cover a great range of artists and styles.
Find us on Patreon, patreon.com/soundrisepod, and social media @soundrisepod.
Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Soundrise Podcast. Hi Alex, how are you doing today?
Hello Vlada, I'm doing good. Struggling a bit with my allergies, so guys, excuse me for my voice. It's another morning episode, Vlada. How do you feel about that?
I feel great, to be honest. I think it's the right idea to get this done in the morning while we're still full of energy. So today, speaking of energy, today we're talking about a very energetic band and a very famous one at that. So Alex, would you reveal to our listeners who we're talking about today?
Yes, this band is a legendary band. You know, they are one of the most influential bands in their category, and that's Metallica. Now, Vlada, I know that if someone would try to find you, they would probably find you at a Metallica concert. That's your second home, I guess. So, can you share a bit of information about this band?
Yeah, so I guess there's not much new we can say about Metallica, but for those who may not be familiar with all the details, the band was founded in LA, in Los Angeles, in 1981, and they recorded their first demo in 1982. One of the first iterations of the band featured none other than Dave Mustaine, who went on to form another formidable act, Megadeth. So there's a lot of notoriety between Dave Mustaine and Metallica about the way he was kicked out of the band. Following his departure, Kirk Hammett joined the band to form the classic lineup of Lars Ulrich, James Hetfield, Kirk Hammett, and Cliff Burton. So this lineup recorded 3 records, which are now widely considered some of the greatest classics of the heavy metal genre. What's really special about Metallica is that in many ways they helped define and shape the thrash metal genre, even though nowadays you'll find a lot of detractors among the thrash metal fans. Originally, Metallica were the true trailblazers of the genre. However, in 1991, the band really hit the big time with their multi-million selling album, the Black Album, or simply the self-titled album Metallica with the infamous black cover. So this album was more streamlined compared to their previous work and sounded somewhat more commercial, which led to these huge sales numbers. And ever since then, Metallica has been somewhat controversial within the metal community. Some people think of them as sellouts, as the band that didn't really stick with metal with full integrity. It did not help that band went through several different changes throughout the years, experimenting with different sounds and different genres, one may add, especially on Load and Reload albums, and then the much maligned Saint Anger that came out in 2003. Nowadays, Metallica are somewhat trying to reconnect with their roots, even though their latest efforts kind of sound like a cross between different things they were doing at different points of their career. And of course, they're still widely popular. They still attract millions and millions of people to their concerts. They still sell millions of albums, but nevertheless, there's still a lot of controversy when it comes to this act. So, Alex, today we're going to have a slightly different approach. We're going to try to talk about their entire discography, not album by album, but more in a sense that we will try to talk about their two different eras, before the Black Album and after the Black Album. And we could kind of say that one of us is more leaning towards the early era, and the other one leans more towards the late stage of the band's career. So, Alex, let's start this with the question of what is your favorite Metallica album? That's what I really want to know.
Okay, good question and not an easy one. Um, I'm kind of torn between Load and Saint Anger, even though both albums offer different stuff, so to say, and different energy and songwriting.
And
Um,
now the heads of the metal heads around the world have just popped because somebody actually said that Saint Anger might be their favorite Metallica record.
yes, yes, dear listeners, I know that this is controversial, and to add a bit of spice, I really like the snare drum on Saint Anger, and I'm really.
Oh, come on, you're giving me a heart attack. The snare drum of all the things on that record, that's what you like?
No, I just want to point it out because I guess that a lot of opposition towards Saint Anger really dislikes that. I really like their drumming there. I think it really stands out. The it makes this album sound iconic because of their drumming,
What
not because of.
exactly is iconic about it? I can just bang on the pots in my kitchen and get the same sound.
Yes, and that really boosts the energy. And what I have to say, uh, actually, I have to ask you: have you ever heard that drum live on Metallica concerts?
No, actually, nowadays when they do Saint Anger songs, they sound much better live and they don't have that grating sound going on.
Oh God.
I recently heard Frantic the last time I saw them live, which was a year ago or less even, before this horrible COVID time, and they did a fantastic version of Frantic. And guess what? It did not include that horrible snare drum, and it had a
It's not
guitar
horrible.
solo. And it had a guitar solo. So what about that? The complete absence of guitar solos on Saint Anger.
I really like it that way. I'm not gonna lie, guys. I really enjoy the album as it is, with all these different sounds, with the absence of solos. This is what Saint Anger is, and it has nothing to do with those melodic guitar solos that you can hear on, let's say, Injustice for All. It is about being consistent, being constant with your punchy sounds. So that's what I like about Saint Anger, and that's why it kind of competes for the first spot on my list. But I have to say, at the end of the day, I think Load is a better album, and it surely deserves my number one spot. Songs like Bleeding Me, uh, King Nothing, like from start to finish, a ton of great tracks. I also like the album cover, and I think this marked a different era. This is the first album that was pretty much different compared to the previous ones. First that I want to point out is James Hetfield's vocals. I think he sounded much better. Well, not much better, but significantly better. Obviously better, because I think that with these older albums, he was leaning towards screaming vocals, while on Load, he was kind of more, let's say, groovy and deep and growling. Would you agree with that, Vlada?
Yeah, definitely. That change of his vocal style is quite evident past the Black Album, and even on the Black Album, you can tell. And what's interesting about that time is that he started taking singing lessons around the time of the Black Album. So yeah, I mean, I kind of like James in all of his different versions. I think he's a phenomenal vocalist in terms of how he expresses himself. He may not have a great range, but he has a lot of power and a lot of gruff, which I really enjoy hearing. And I think especially on Load, I like how badass he sounds, like this sort of take no prisoners attitude, and he sounds real. He sounds genuine. You know, the thing is, this might be a controversial thing to say, but as much as I love his vocals on the early albums, and though that style of singing really fits the early albums perfectly, I think he sounds more genuine on Load. I think that's who he really is. You know, when he sings songs like The House That Jack Built, which is about his own personal demons fighting with alcoholism, you can tell, you know, that he's digging deep into his soul. And this is something that's kind of absent from some of the early stuff, even though the early stuff also has personal stuff, don't get me wrong, especially songs like Dyer's Eve, where he addresses all the trauma that he had dealing with his parents. Uh, but yeah, I think there's something to that style which is present on Load.
Do you think that songwriting on both Load and Saint Anger were more, let's say, realistic and more, I don't know, human, less poetic and less artistic? Would you agree with that?
Uh, well, I would definitely say that the early albums had a much more elaborate style of writing, and they were, I don't know, you know, sometimes this might be a weird comparison, but when I think about the early albums like Master of Puppets, or Ride the Lightning, or And Justice for All, uh, it kind of reminds me of the way Pink Floyd made albums. Like they're so elaborate, so rich in detail. The lyrics are very well thought out. Like everything is just everything is so intricate, but in a way that's very accessible. You know, unlike so many other metal bands of the era, I think Metallica knew how to be both arty and accessible, which I think elevated them above all other acts. And then with Load and Saint Anger, it's more primal. It's more just pure emotion, rather than seeking some great artistic heights. Even though there are exceptions to that rule as well. I mean, on Load, you have songs like The Outlaw Torn or Bleeding Me, which I find to be some of the greatest songs the guys ever did. And they're also 9 minute epics, rich in musical detail, just in a different way. So yeah, I kind of agree with your assessment there. But speaking of that, what do you think about the early albums? So if I understood correctly, you really lean more towards the late period, which is quite unusual and very rare for Metallica fans. So what do you think about those early records, starting with Kill 'Em All and then ending with And Justice for All, or let's say Black Album as a transitional point?
Okay, before I jump to the older albums, I just want to point out I really like Jason Newsted as a person, and I think that when he was at Metallica, I think that he was the backbone of that band and really provided the soul of Metallica. Even though I think his bass playing was pretty much underestimated, he has some really good riffs on Load, but overall I think that he wasn't featured enough. But that's another story. Let me get back to your question. So the early stuff. Okay, so Kill 'Em All. I remember, Vlada, that when we talked about Metallica a couple of years ago, you said, "Oh, Kill 'Em All is the album that everybody likes," and I think that Kill 'Em All is, yes, it is accessible, and to me it sounds like punk music meets heavy metal,
Yeah,
which is a
that's
really
exactly what it is. Yes.
and that's really cool. I like the sound. I like the album cover, one of the best Metallica album covers in my opinion. And I really get kind of angry whenever I see some edits when someone is trying to make a meme of this album cover because it's so good and original. So Kill 'Em All, a good album, nothing major to complain about here. Then the other albums are kind of going a step forward, a step ahead, so to say. The Ride Lighting also has that legendary album artwork, but it has a different approach, and I think Ride the Lightning is where their legendary status starts to grow. What do you think?
Well, I would definitely say that Kill 'Em All is where the legend begins because I think Kill 'Em All is a record that, while imperfect and while obviously recorded by a very young, inexperienced band, pretty much defined the genre of thrash metal. I think that they combined that punk sensibility with their new wave of British heavy metal influences like Diamond Head, Judas Priest, stuff like that. And that's where they forced the new sound. And then they took that formula and did something even grander with it on Ride the Lightning, where their songwriting became even more mature. Uh, the compositions became more detailed, less punk oriented, but still pretty aggressive. They added a ballad, which at that time, interestingly enough, for so many metal fans at that time, that was considered a sellout. Adding a ballad to your album, A Fade to Black is the ballad in question. Such a hauntingly beautiful tune about suicide. And I think
It's a
they,
beautiful song.
yeah, and they just took it up a notch with that one, and then just kind of continued with Muster and Justice for All. I think it's really hard to tell. It's really hard to choose one out of those three records. They're so consistent and so great. So it's only like a matter of your own mood. Even though I kind of gravitate mostly towards Injustice for All, but on some days when I listen to Master of Puppets, I really think it's the most immaculate heavy metal recording of all time. It almost sounds otherworldly. What they did on Master, just that atmosphere, the sounds. It's like it doesn't sound human. It sounds like it's made somewhere else, outside this realm of existence. And that's why sometimes when you listen to the Black Album or Load, you may feel very disappointed by comparison. If you just listen to something like Master of Puppets, it's so epic and grand and otherworldly that that other stuff just sounds kind of plain by comparison. And I think that's wrong, but that's how you may feel if you listen to them back to back. I just think that these later records have different sort of strengths going for them. And these strengths are not any less important than what they had going in the early years, but still that kind of magnitude, I think, is something unmatched by most metal bands. What do you think about that?
I think that's a fair and objective statement, and I think that you're not letting your emotions and your personal taste get in the way. Um, yes, and speaking of Diamond Hand, you mentioned that band. Let's not forget the great cover done by Metallica of the song "Am I Evil?" I think that's one of the first songs that I heard from Kill 'Em All. But obviously, we all know "Seek and Destroy" and "Whiplash" and other
I
and
just
other
need to
songs.
correct you a bit because Emma Evil wasn't originally on Kill 'Em All, but there are some editions where it's a bonus track. So, yeah, it was recorded around that time. I think after Kill 'Em All was recorded, and it came out originally on Creeping Death EP. So, this was the time around Ride the Lightning, or maybe between the two records.
Okay, thanks. Now, Vlad, I want to ask you about um, "And Justice for All." Now, you know that I'm a bass player and that I always focus on bass lines. I love that album because of its energy, because of the thunderous guitars, because also of the fast bass drumming. But how do you explain and how do you get over the fact that the bass is so quiet on this album? Knowing that Jason Newsted, a very cool and important member of Metallica, was there. How do you explain that?
Well, I mean, there are many versions about this. Um, the most common belief is that the band was still so grief stricken after the death of Cliff Burton in 1986. Their their great bass player, the guy who the guy who was more than just a mere band member, who had a lot of knowledge about music theory, who was able to contribute to songs in a major way. For example, on For Whom the Bell Tolls, you can hear his wonderful bass line at the beginning. It kind of drives the song forward. And most importantly, he was their friend, and they were a very tight knit group. So when this happened, they almost didn't go on. They almost refused to carry on. But then, after some considerations, they decided to get a new bass player. And Jason really wanted it badly. Jason went there fully prepared. He managed to get their set list somewhere and learned every song, every detail. And they saw that this guy was willing to give everything for this band. And mind you, it's really important to point out that Jason Newsted, prior to joining Metallica, was the leader of another really good heavy metal act, Flotsam and Jetsam. So he left this band, even though they were doing, relatively speaking, they were doing well, but not like Metallica, of course, not even close. And he was willing to give up that position of creativity, of leading the band, of being able to call the shots, to just be another guy in Metallica. That's how important Metallica was to metal fans back then, I think. So the theory goes that they deliberately muted his bass as a sort of tribute to Cliff Burton. Now, the band members still deny this to this day, and they say the problem was that their ears were shut from all the concerts and they couldn't hear well in the mixing room, so they kept putting the treble up and the bass down, and as a result you have the record where the bass is barely audible, which I think is a shame. So as a kid, when I listened to this record, when I listened to Injustice for All, I didn't really pay attention to the mix, to the bass or anything. I just took the music as it was, and it was amazing that way. And one thing I have to point out is that it had this incredibly haunting sound, which now, in retrospect, I see is the direct result of the mix of the record. So I'm not really sure that a different mix would improve the record. I think I really love it the way it is. Now, of course, I think I would like to hear it with more bass or with a different mix, just out of curiosity. But this album to me is perfection. Just the band at the height of its power. James' vocals really came into their own. He has this really intense sound, like his gruffy vocals truly dominate here. Kirk has never had better solos than on Injustice for All. And most importantly, this is the most political album of their career. And it just shows this band with without any will to compromise with anything, which I think is directly responsible for fans being so disappointed with their later output, because they felt that that band from Injustice for All, the band that was willing to challenge the world, was kind of gone. You know, that the band members sort of went soft by comparison. And the riffs on Injustice for All are just out of this world. I have to say, James Hetfield is a true riff master. What do you say about that?
I have to say that Injustice for All is probably my favorite old school album. Not sure if it's Injustice for All or Kill 'Em All. The melodic and the theatrical aspect of Injustice for All is amazing. And um, as we sit here and record, it's August 24. Tomorrow, Injustice for All is turning 32 years old. So happy 32nd birthday to Injustice for All. And I want to ask you about the drumming that I mentioned, Vlada, that we talked about a lot in this episode. A lot of people out there, a lot of music fans say that Lars Ulrich is a mediocre drummer, or if you take him out of Metallica, he wouldn't be able to produce anything. What do you think about his drumming skill set?
Look, I think people are exaggerating at times because Lars, to me, sounds like a fairly competent drummer, especially on those early records. He sounds damn amazing on Master of Puppets, for example. I think that it's quite possible that over the years his drumming skills have somewhat deteriorated, and maybe that's what rubs the fans the wrong way, especially when they compare the drumming on Metallica albums to the drumming on other heavy metal albums by Slayer or Megadeth. It kind of leaves something to be desired, especially these last few records. But I think people have to take into consideration that Lars, alongside James, is one of the true masterminds of this band, and uh, I think that's if you take Lars out of Metallica, you won't have Metallica. So as simple as that. I think there's no band without him or James. Now, in my opinion, this is my personal view, is that James is the one who propelled the band to the stardom. I think that without James, Lars wouldn't get anywhere. But that being said, he probably had a massive role in shaping the sound, making sure that the songs are structured in a certain way. So I wouldn't underestimate him. And I think he's still a fairly good drummer. When I see them live, I really don't mind his drumming so much. Except one time in Belgrade when they played live, I was kind of close to the stage. And never ever in my life have I experienced this. His drum was so loud that it literally made me physically sick. And it literally ruined the music a bit for me. And I think that shows that Lars might have a huge ego issue. I think nobody needs to be that loud, you know?
Yes, because the drums are, always the loudest instrument, but if it's too loud, it kind of ruins the experience, definitely. I don't really think that he's a bad drummer. I think he perfectly suits Metallica, and as I said, I really like the innovation of that pot snare
Oh,
drum
come
on
on,
Saint Anger.
please, please, we'll lose all kind of all integrity that we have amassed so far throughout all these episodes. You're just gonna throw it in the wind with
Look,
your ridiculous statements about Lars' pot sounding drums.
look, I'm in the minority here, and I'm not ashamed of it because it's something that always stands out and always
All
puts
shred,
the it
all shreds
always
of
boosts the
credibility just
energy.
gone. Yeah, gone, gone. I'm sorry, dear listeners. I think at this moment we have nothing else to do but to shut down our podcast. So I apologize for this travesty that was being said in this episode, and we will try to bounce back and recover from this somehow.
I can sense Metallica fans throwing stones at us because of all these um, blasphemic statements from me. um, okay, my final word about the first era, so to say, of Metallica. So I wasn't a huge fan of the sound, especially uh, the bass. I'm not talking about the solos, and I really like the melodic element, but when it comes to mixing it and the final outcome, it wasn't really my cup of tea compared to Load and Saint Anger and also Reload. And I thought that the vocals were better in the 90s in Metallica. So, Vlad, I would like to wrap this up with your opinion on the Black album, so the transition album of Metallica.
But first, we forgot to talk about the big one, the big album. we mentioned it, but I still didn't really get your opinion about Master of Puppets, because that's the one where people go crazy, where people think that that's the album that makes people believe Metallica is the greatest metal band of all time. So what's your take on that one?
Oh yes, yeah. Oh, sorry, I forgot that. Okay, okay. So Master of Puppets features some of the greatest Metallica songs. Orion, Battery, also the title track, Master of Puppets. Um, I don't know. I really kind of associated with the metal genre. Like I would always single out this album as one of the greatest. But if I would to compare it to my music taste, it wouldn't be one of the greatest. I have to say, Vlada. To put it shortly, is that
Dear listeners, another travesty that was said here. So again, you have to forgive my dear colleague. He he just grew up in another era, and obviously this just
I'm a
went
new
over his
metal
head.
fan, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's the guy who likes corn. What else can we say?
Oh, that would be a really good question. Do we have fans that like both Metallica and Korn? And by Metallica, I mean these old albums.
Oh, I'm
Really,
sure. Yeah, probably. So if you are out there and you like both Korn and Metallica's old stuff, let us know in the comments. Let's break the stereotypes. Let's show people that you can enjoy all these things, and that there's no shame in it, right?
there's no shame at all. It's just this co-host of mine called Vlada that likes to separate people and accuse them of being traitors and stuff. Yes.
Not the
Okay.
traitor. You just lack the sensibility to understand the magnitude of the early Metallica, and for some reason you prefer listening to people banging on cooking pots.
Well, that was a good description, I have to say. Okay, so back to Master of Puppets. And with all these, this is the case with all these old albums. I can listen to them and I can show respect and see the originality and the authentic stuff, but I can't really go crazy about this, Vlada.
For the life of me, I just don't get it. I just don't understand how anyone can be indifferent to this kind of music. I think those four early records, especially the ones from Ride the Lightning to And Justice for All, are such epic pieces of music that even to this day, I still get chills when I listen to these records, even though I pretty much know them by heart, and I've listened to them for more than 20 years now. I think I listened to Injustice for All for the first time back in 1994, so that's a long period of time, and it still gives me the same feeling. So I just don't understand. Or Master of Puppets, these songs like Disposable Heroes or Leper Messiah. Like there's something so deep in these songs. So like I just find it so difficult to find any other metal bands that gave me a similar feel. Maybe Death. I think even though I didn't really grow up with Death, so I don't have that kind of attachment. But it just these albums are unique, truly unique.
Yes, they are, and mind you, I'm not indifferent. I'm just not blown away by them, I have to say. Now, someone would consider that to be indifferent or ignoring the true aspect or underappreciating these albums, but at the end of the day, it's all about our personal taste, Vlada, right?
Well, yeah, but you can only go so far with personal taste. But okay, let's stop joking around with this stuff. I mean, of course, I guess for some people, it just doesn't cut it the same way. But to me, it's interesting to talk about these more controversial albums, because when we when it comes to Master of Puppets or when it comes to Ride the Lightning, I think most people will agree that these are great records. I don't think many people will actually claim that these are bad in any way, right? So, what about the Black Album, as you already mentioned? The Black Album, in my opinion, is not a step forward for Metallica, but it was a step that maybe they needed to make at that time. And I think as much as commercial it came off, it was still a wonderful record. And when I was a kid, I didn't really make a difference between this record and the earlier ones. To me, it was all the same kind of Metallica that I loved and enjoyed. It was only when Load came out that I was in utter confusion. I didn't know what to make of it as a 13-year-old, I think, or a 12-year-old. 12-year-old, yes. When Load came out, I was so disappointed because that wasn't my Metallica. It sounded like a completely different band. But with Black Album, yeah, that's the same Metallica that you hear on Master of Puppets. They're just more streamlined, maybe more catchy, throwing in a couple of ballads, but the feel is generally the same. And I don't understand why fans make such a big fuss about it, certain fans. Just enjoy the music. It's a great record, great riffs. Um, Maybe not as epic as the previous ones, but who cares? I mean, it's still a great record, right?
Absolutely, I totally agree. It was a slight step back compared to the previous albums in my eyes. I don't know. It was as I said, it was a transitional album, and I couldn't quite pick the side here. It was difficult for me because I'm more of second stage Metallica fan, so to say. So this was slightly confusing, but you can't really ignore all the um, all the great tracks here. Now I want to ask you, Vlada, you have two probably most well-known songs here of Metallica, Enter Sandman and Nothing Else Matters. Would you classify them as the best tracks on this album?
No, 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 not at all. Even though I have to say, both tracks, I really enjoy them. They've been overplayed to death, but when I hear them in concert, I really enjoy them in such setting. When I'm at home, I don't really want to hear them so much, to be fair. But to me, the real highlights of the Black Album are the deeper cuts. You know, songs like Holier Than Thou, The God That Failed. The God That Failed is such a personal song by James. And that's why I don't understand all these accusations of the band selling out and stuff like that. When a band sells out, they don't write personal stuff. They don't write the stuff where they put themselves out to the world, where they expose their own weaknesses, let's say, or their own traumas or psychological issues, addictions. That's not what commercial bands do. So, in my opinion, Metallica never really sold out in that way, in that sense. They might have sold out in some other ways, in terms of like being this big commercial entity that is soon going to turn into Kiss and start selling like caskets with Metallica written on it or some shit like that, you know. So, but no, I think these songs come from the same place that the earlier material came from, but maybe even from the more mature place in some instances, like with The God That Failed or The Unforgiven, which I feel are very personal songs.
Yes, you just mentioned The Unforgiven. What do you think about the fact that The Unforgiven has also The Unforgiven 2 and Unforgiven 3? Like, that's a really interesting continuation of a single song.
Yeah, I really wonder how that came about because I always thought of The Unforgiven 2 as some kind of reversal of The Unforgiven 1. Like it has a lot of similar musical elements and I really enjoyed it when it came out. I remember being super stoked about that song. But then The Unforgiven 3 also sounds quite good, especially this new version they did with the orchestra on SNM 2. So check that out when it's more available. I think it's already available. So check that out. But I don't know. I really wonder how that came about, what James was thinking, whether it was an accident, you know, the way he stumbled upon the second song, and then maybe when they were doing Death Magnetic, they kind of wanted to reverse the clock, go back in time. So I think they wanted to revisit some of the moments in their catalog. So maybe that's why they did the third one. But yeah, Black Album, I think, as I previously said, has a lot of personal stuff, and it's more polished, has that Bob Rock production, but I don't think they sold out. I think that they felt they needed to make a move towards a more streamlined sound because they were kind of lost in all those progressive rock riffs that And Justice for All contains.